Thank you all for joining us in our last event for the Pre-Modern Islamic World lecture series here at NYU. My name is Antonio Musto. I'm a PhD candidate in the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies Department and the co-organizer of this series. And before we begin, I just want to briefly explain the format of the talk. So we will begin, so after our guest, Professor Mohamad Ballan, gives a talk, we will open the floor to questions. And for those of you in person, if you have a question, obviously feel free to raise your hand. And those on Zoom, you will have the ability to enter in your questions in the Q&A box. And I'll do my best to alternate between online questions and in-person questions. And before we begin, I would like to thank the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies, the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies Department, the support of the administrators as well, and the student workers whose assistance has been instrumental for ensuring the smooth functioning of this lecture series. Without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my old friend, Professor Mohamad Ballan, who is currently an assistant professor of history at Stony Brook University in New York and studies the intellectual, cultural, and political history of late medieval Iberia and North Africa. He received his PhD from the Department of History at the University of Chicago in 2019, and has previously held appointments as a junior fellow at the Dartmouth Society of Fellows, as a Mellon Faculty Fellow at the Medieval Institute, and as a Mellon Faculty Fellow at the Medieval Institute at the University of Notre Dame. In both his writing and his teaching, Ballan highlights the interconnected histories of Europe, Asia, and Africa through a close examination of social, intellectual, and political networks. In his first manuscript, Lord of the Pen and Sword, Sovereignty and History in the Islamic West, which is currently under review with Oxford University Press, Ballan explores the phenomenon of the scholar-statesman, figures who ascended to the highest offices of state through the life and works of Lisan ad-Din ibn al-Khatib, the most prominent Spanish Muslim historian, chancellor, and philosopher of the 14th century. His book situates this figure within a broader community of leaders, a network of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars that extended from Seville to Damascus, in order to illustrate how these scholar officials played a major role in reshaping the political culture, social hierarchies, and conceptions of sovereignty in Nasrid, Granada, and beyond. The floor is now yours, Mohamad, who will be giving a talk titled The Politics of Judaism, Religion, Religious Co-Production, and Sectarian Polemics in the Fatimid Caliphate.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio, for that very, very generous introduction. I hope everyone on Zoom can hear me. I apologize if you can't. I'll make sure I keep the microphone very close to me throughout this time. So good afternoon, everyone in the room and on Zoom. Let me begin by thanking Antonio Musto and the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies for the very generous invitation to be here today. It really is a pleasure for me to share some of my work with you. So my talk today, and I'll try to keep it to 45 minutes, but stop me at a hard 45 minutes if you have to, Antonio, is an attempt to provoke some discussion about the importance of religious co-production for the shaping of sectarian discourses and identities within the context of the medieval Islamic world. So let me start with that term, religious co-production. It's a concept developed by the historical theologian Katharina Hayden and the historian David Nirenberg. At its most basic, it can be defined as the entanglement between the interpretive and hermeneutical traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The concept allows us to appreciate how the many and varied Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities across history formed, reformed, and transformed themselves by interacting with, thinking about, or imagining each other. As Hayden and Nirenberg have argued in a forthcoming piece, co-production can and must be studied not only across, but also within each of these three religious traditions, all of which have a rich history of sectarian diversification and heresiological dispute, in which figures of other religions were frequently deployed. So Hayden and Nirenberg have further argued that since Judaism, Christianity, and Islam compete over a shared canon of prophetic events thought to have occurred in the past, there is a shared potential for historical hermeneutics between them. It is with these two central questions, the co-production of sectarian identity and the ways in which such an identity was rooted in a particular mode of reading the biblical past, that my talk is concerned. So over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, I will seek to do so by closely examining the Fatimid Ismāʿīlī tradition and its rich textual corpus during the medieval period. As a historian, I consider this to be a particularly productive textual corpus to think with for two reasons. Firstly, the Ismāʿīlīs, one of the major groups within Shia Islam that emerged during the early Middle Ages, allow us to understand how the co-production of sectarian identity, was evident across many different schools of thought in medieval Islam, with similar narratives, texts, and frameworks being adopted by both Sunnis and Shi'is in their polemics. Secondly, and perhaps most significantly, for what I'm about to say today, is the Fatimid case represents the only example in Islamic history of a Shi'i caliphate, which ruled over a substantial portion of the Islamic world. The Fatimid realm encompassed numerous religious, cultural, and linguistic groups, and at its height included, as you can see here, much of North Africa, Sicily, Egypt, the Levant, the Hijaz, and the Yemen, and established a foothold among Muslim communities in Iran and in Western India. So the Fatimid Caliphate, which bridged Africa, Asia, and Europe, served as an important political context for the entangled histories of the various communities of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Mediterranean world between the 9th and 12th centuries. Rather than examining the quotidian interactions and polemical encounters between these various religious communities in the Fatimid context, as so many others have done so well, my concern here is to specifically examine how the notion of co-production allows us to better understand the ways in which the figures of Judaism, and to a lesser degree Christianity, and here by figures I mean hermeneutical figures of Judaism, and to a lesser degree Christianity, played a key role in how Muslims articulated their own theological and religious claims. It is nevertheless important to remain cognizant of this broader imperial context that I'm showing you here, since these realities shape both the stakes and the particular forms of the articulation of sectarian identity in the 12th century Islamic world. So the paper draws extensively upon Ismāʿīlī texts produced between the 9th and 13th centuries, but focuses primarily on one, the Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah fi Ibṭāl al-Daʿwah al-Nizāriyyah, the guide of the Imam al-Āmir in eliminating the Nizārī Sect. So this text, itself an embodiment of a more literal type of co-production between an Ismāʿīlī Imam Caliph, a 12er Shi'i chief minister, and a secretary in the Fatimid chancery, constitutes the most important Fatimid polemic against the emerging Nizārī Ismāʿīlīs of Syria and Iran. And these Nizaris, of course, immortalized by Marco Polo, among others, as the assassins of legend, right, were among the most ardent religious and political opponents of the Fatimid Caliphate in the early 12th century. And it is this particular group that is identified within this text as the Jews of the Muslim community, Yahud Hadihil al-Ummah. Rather than situating a reading of this text solely within the narrow confines of Fatimid dynastic politics, or the equally obscure to many of us, maybe, context of intra-sectarian rivalries within Ismāʿīlī Shi'ism, I argue that it is imperative that we read it as a key example of the role of anti-Judaism in structuring the classification and formulation of sectarian identity within the medieval Islamic world. For centuries, this framework had shaped the ways in which Ismāʿīlī missionaries and authors, particularly in the Fatimid context, had constructed other groups of Muslims. And this particular document illustrates how these concepts were put to work in new ways in the service of the refutation of these Nizaris. It is particularly important to think carefully about two aspects of the Hidāyah. First, the deployment of ta'wil, or allegorical esoteric interpretation, of both of the Hebrew Bible and of the Quran. And then secondly, the anti-Judaism that structured the critique of all those who opposed the legitimate designation, or nas, of the Imams, whether companions of Muhammad in the distant past or the Nizaris in the present. So my paper will first provide a broader view of this historical context in which the Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah was produced, before hopefully quickly turning to these two aspects of the text in turn. I can really get bogged down in Fatimid politics, so I beg your indulgence here. So the Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah was a historical document. This is the first claim I want to make in my talk today. That was produced in a distinct political and intellectual context, the Chancery, in the aftermath of the disputes over succession that had divided the Ismāʿīlī community in the Near East during the late 5th or 11th and early 6th, 12th centuries. This was also the moment in which the Crusades were ongoing. The Nizārī Ismāʿīlīs emerged as a major political and religious force in Iran and Syria, and the authority of the Fatimid Imam Caliphs themselves contested by the rise of powerful chief ministers or wazirs. So this political context fundamentally shaped the specific arguments of the Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah and reveals the important stakes of its formulation of a particular polemic about the boundaries of community through the construction of the Nizaris as the Jews of the Muslim community. So in 1094, the Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Mustansir Billah, who had reigned for nearly 50 years over a vast realm, died. Following his death, his youngest son, Abul Qasim Ahmad, was enthroned as the 9th Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Musta'li Billah. This succession took place as a result of the intervention of the Fatimid chief minister and military commander, al-Afdal Shahanshah. So the elevation of Musta'li as Imam Caliph by al-Afdal was not uncontested. It prompted a rebellion by the eldest son, an heir apparent of al-Mustansir, Nizar, who fled to Alexandria and rallied his partisans. However, he was soon defeated by al-Afdal and killed, presumably killed, several months later, a fact which allowed al-Musta'li, under the supreme influence of his chief minister, to secure his authority over Egypt as Imam Caliph. The execution of Nizar, as these things rarely do, did not put an end to his partisans, known as Nizaris, who continued to emphasize the legitimacy of his succession, and established an extensive network of da'is, missionaries, and agents throughout the Near East, becoming implacable opponents of the Fatimid Caliphate during the early 12th century. They would wage a violent campaign of assassinations and intimidation against Fatimid officials, partisans, and caliphs, and were perceived as a serious threat to both the religious integrity and the security of the Fatimid Caliphate. Although you might ask yourself, is this guy just going to keep talking about dynastic politics? No. But it is important to keep in mind the complexity of dynastic politics, powerful wazirs, and court intrigue throughout this period, because it does shape the outcome of royal succession in the Middle Ages. But in the Fatimid context, the very nature of legitimate authority itself magnifies the importance of paying attention to succession. The idea of the imamate, and I know this is very preliminary for many of you, so forgive me if I'm rehashing what you already know better than I do, particularly within the Fatimid Ismāʿīlī context, is crucial to better understanding the larger historical stakes of the Hidāyah. The Fatimid rulers were not just seen as temporal lords or kings by their followers, but viewed as the sole legitimate heirs of the Prophet Muhammad and his direct descendants through his daughter Fatima and her husband Ali ibn Abi Talib. The Fatimids were caliphs but also imams, infallible beings endowed with supreme spiritual authority to legislate Islamic belief and practice, interpret scripture, and govern the affairs of humanity. The convergence of political as well as religious authority within the person of the Fatimid Imam Caliph and the supreme importance attached to the idea of nas, or divinely mandated designation, meant that the controversial question of succession to al-Mustansir in 1094 had major implications for the unity of the Ismāʿīlī Shi'i community. As a result of these events described above, the Fatimid Ismāʿīlī movement was fractured into two main opposing camps, with the partisans of Nizar, based mainly in Syria and Iran, emerging as a competing Ismāʿīlī sect that challenged the legitimacy of al-Musta'li, and his successors who ruled in Egypt. Over the next several decades, the schism led to the evolution of two distinct religio-political movements and systems of thought. As you can see here, it's one of the major sort of splits between the Ismāʿīlīs in the 12th century, which will have major implications for the history, religious, cultural, and political of the Islamic world moving forward. So the Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah really helps shed light on the various claims and arguments deployed during the early years of the schism. So the text bearing the name of the Fatimid Caliph al-Āmir, who was actually al-Musta'li's son and successor, was written around 1122 by Ibn al-Sayrafi, a leading secretary within the Fatimid chancery. The epistle's main objective was to refute the claims of the Nizaris, whose movement had attracted a large number of adherents since 1094, and was intended as a proof text of the legitimacy of al-Musta'li as well as al-Āmir, as his son, right, as a divinely ordained successor and imam and caliph. So the document reflects the official doctrinal position, in other words, of the Fatimid Caliphate in this period. So the epistle was based upon the proceedings of a council. There's always a council, held in Shawwal 516, December 1122, under the auspices of al-Āmir and his newly appointed chief minister, al-Ma'mun al-Batā'ihi, a 12er Shi'i, right? So already giving you a sense of the religious diversity at play here. The council was convened in the Fatimid royal palace with many high-ranking members of the Ismāʿīlī Daʿwah and royal administration present. According to surviving fragments of the 12th century history written by Ibn al-Ma'mun, guess again, the son of the aforementioned Fatimid chief minister himself, and preserved for us by the 9th, 15th century historian Taqi ad-Din al-Maqrizi, who tends to be the source for many of these things, we're told that in the month of Shawwal 516, the Caliph al-Āmir sent an emissary to the Lord of Alamut, Hassan Sabah. This occurred following a council of Ismāʿīlī and Imami religious scholars, and as you can see, including many of these leading jurists, and including with the presence of the children of al-Mustansir, the surviving children, some of the Caliph al-Amir's nephews, right, as well as the head of the chancery and some of the emirs. The chief minister asked them, "What are your arguments against these Nizaris who have rebelled against the Ismāʿīlīs?" They each replied, "Nizar cannot be considered an imam, and anyone who believes in his imamate has left this school of thought, gone astray, and must be killed." So here, this Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah, this document, which is issued in the immediate aftermath of this council, preserves for us many of the theological, legal, and historical arguments that were mobilized against the Nizārī movement during this council, and reflects an increasingly hard line towards the Nizáris. This is not a conciliatory document in any respect, as you will see. Following this council, the Fatimid chief minister al-Ma'mun commanded the Sheikh Abul Qasim ibn Sayrafi, the aforementioned Ibn Sayrafi, to compose an official decree, sijil, that would be publicly read and copies of it circulated to different regions on the aforementioned matter of negating Nizar's claim. It also seems that a copy of it was sent to Hassan Sabah as well. So there's a lot more that one can say about the actual historical context of the very production of this document, but I want to turn now a little bit to the actual implications of this. The excommunication and condemnation of all Nizáris to death, I also want to really highlight this, which coincided with very real measures to identify, arrest, and execute all known sympathizers within Egypt, reminds us of the stakes in the imperial context at play here. This is not just a theoretical refutation. In other words, the political crisis facing the Fatimids was twofold. It was precisely at this moment of schism that the Latin Crusaders had established themselves in the Holy Land. The entire reign of al-Musta'li and al-Āmir would be consumed with that matter. And then more importantly, for our purposes here, is the emergence of a very strong and very coordinated Nizārī challenge to the Fatimids under the leadership, a very capable leadership of Hassan Sabah in this period. So the text serves for us, as an illustration of that tension and of the urgency with which it was addressed in this period. So the document was circulated as early as 516, early 1123 among the Nizáris of Damascus. So remember, it's not just Iran and Egypt here. Syria, again, very much at the heart of the Crusades as well, is very much in play. And it's actually this text, again, a little bit of trivia, that gives us the first known usage of the word hashishiyah, right? Where they're referred to as consumers of hashish. So just giving us a sense of the polemics here, right? A term that will have a very long genealogy, of course, moving forward. So it's very important to think about the actual technical aspects of the text, its manuscript tradition, etc. But for the sake of time, I want to move forward to think about the co-production of sectarian identity within the text. So the contention between the two factions, Musta'lis and Nizáris, was increasingly violent throughout the early 12th century. Assassination, subterfuge, incarceration, execution. This was the cycle of violence that we could see in this period. So this context of hardening sectarian boundaries is evident within the Hidāyah itself. The vitriolic rhetoric against the Nizáris and the various rhetorical and polemical strategies employed by the text, which it should be remembered was the product of the royal chancery of a significant imperial polity, should not be dissociated from this broader social and political context. It is equally important to remember that even as the Hidāyah directed its primary arguments against Nizáris in Iran and Syria, many other communities, Sunnis, Jews, Christians, 12 Shi'is, were implicated within the text, and in fact, were part of the formation of the text in many respects. So although a variety of legal, theological proofs, historical arguments, and rhetorical strategies are utilized within the document, one of the most important is its construction of the Nizáris as the Jews of the Muslim community, a claim embedded within Quranic and biblical texts, symbols, and narratives. So the idea of the Nizáris as the Jews of the Muslim community, phrase utilized at least twice within the text directly, requires a critical engagement with the co-production of sectarian identity within Ismāʿīlism itself. Far from being unique to this particular document, anti-Judaism was central to the formation of Ismāʿīlī, and particularly Fatimid Ismāʿīlī sectarian identity, and to the ways in which it sought to condemn all other forms of Islam as rebellious, transgressive, and misguided. The Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah provides an important illustration of the manner in which this anti-Judaism, which served as a crucial touchstone for the formation of Islamic identity within early Islam, was put to work within the specific context of Fatimid Ismāʿīlism. So following the initial doxology, exalting God, the Prophet, and the Imams as bearers of light onto the universe and the source of all true guidance, the Hidāyah proclaims that indeed the one who is truly lost is the, and can you all say good? Okay. Who resists, is the individual who resists those who are the intimates of God, awliya Allah, refuses to recognize the right of the Imam of his faith and thinks badly of them, while following for himself leaders of misguidance whom he established for himself. Seems very generic, right? But in fact, here, this is critiquing the Nizáris on three very specific counts. Their refusal to acknowledge the true Imam of the age, whether al-Musta'li or al-Āmir, the present Fatimid Imam Caliph. The establishment of false leaders or anti-imams, if you will, right, who are then taken as sources of truth and guidance, and the resistance to those considered intimates of God, namely the true Imam of the age and his followers, and the refusal to be guided towards a straight path. Significantly, this statement is embedded between two Quranic verses, right? The first of which states, "O you who believe, if you obey a group of those who receive the scripture, they would turn you back from your belief and make you disbelievers. Whoever holds firmly to God's words will be guided to the straight path." The second verse, centering on the narrative of Moses and the Israelites in the desert, proclaims that the latter have incurred condemnation, humiliation, and disgrace, and brought upon themselves wrath from God. This is because they rejected God's revelations and killed the prophets unjustly. This is because they disobeyed and transgressed. Both of these verses explicitly condemn Jews or the children of Israel for failing to uphold God's commandments, resisting the commands of their own imams, and serving as major opponents of divine guidance, even murdering their own prophets. This is what's being invoked by the text, right? This is the polemical tradition that it's engaging with. So from the outset of the Hidāyah, therefore, it's quite clear that, like many of their counterparts within the Sunni and Twelver Shi'i traditions at the same period, this particular group of Muslims, the Fatimid Ismāʿīlīs, sought to represent their theological or political opponents, and for this intent, there's no difference here for all intents and purposes, as counterparts to the rebellious and transgressive Banu Israel or children of Israel of the Quran, right? So this Quranic framework in which an adversarial relationship to prophecy and divine guidance is marked as a particularly Jewish error structures the critique of Nizaris throughout the Hidāyah. This framework formed the basis for the exclusion of the Nizaris from the elite rank of true believers, the Mu'minun, with the Hidāyah condemning them as having apostatized from the faith, once again invoking that same verse, 261 of the Quran. It should be said that the likes of those who turn away from the limits of God, the Imams, Hudud Allah, right? This is, again, that allegorical interpretation at play, and their divine knowledge and claim precedence with regards to the guardianship, al-Wilayah, arbitrarily make judgments about the imamate and violate the covenant of faith who have descended from the rank of the elite true faith to the rank of the erroneous masses. Verily, divergent opinions and sects cannot be found amongst the people of the Daʿwah and within the inviolable sanctum of the imamate. Indeed, these have incurred the condemnation, humiliation, and disgrace from God for their divergence, apostasy, and their abandonment of traditions of their guidance. Not very subtle. But there we have it. The characterization of the Nizaris as violating the covenant of faith, and the covenant of faith here is the Imam, right? Is here linked directly with Quran 261, a verse, as I just mentioned, that constituted an attack against Israelite deviance and disobedience to prophecy and divine injunction. The Hidāyah leaves little room for ambiguity and explicitly characterizes Nizaris as the Jews of the Muslim community. As if it wasn't clear enough, it then uses the phrase, it deploys it directly on the basis of their deliberate and nefarious concealment of prophetic knowledge. Are you not astonished, the text asks rhetorically, at a sect, Ta'ifa, aligned with the devil, which has violated the Quran and greatly earned many evil deeds in the religion of God? It has violated the inviolable and irreproachable tenets of this religion so that they resemble the Jews of this nation in the manner in which they conceal the truth after they have known it and in the manner in which they avoid truthfulness even after it has been made clear and evident. These are a people who claim the imamate for Nizar without any clear proof or authoritative evidence of the latter's designation to guide them to this conclusion. Rather, they were blinded by their insidiousness, which deceived the minds of the gullible, and by some fabricated rumors which are camouflaged by their being distant from the center of power. There's a very veiled reference here to Damascus, Iran, right? The Hidāyah also represents the Nizaris as the Jews of the Muslim community for violating the divine covenant and considers the establishment of false imams to be the equivalent of idolatry. Whoever doubts this matter, the imamate of al-Musta'li, has gone forth from the covenant of religion and has diverged from the bond of the believers and is from among the Jews of this nation, second usage here. And those who said, make a god for us like the gods that they have, he said, indeed, you are an ignorant people. So the establishment of false imams is here likened to the fashioning of the golden calf, right? A key event in the construction of Jewish theological error and deviance within the Islamic theological and scriptural tradition. It also served to condemn the Nizaris not only as misguided Ismāʿīlīs of a lesser rank than true believers, but as disbelievers and apostates entirely. This anti-Judaism serves as the essential frame for understanding the entire critique of the Nizaris, who were represented as Jews, right, for all intents and purposes. And it is this hermeneutical anti-Judaism that permeates the entire text, heavily informing, how the Nizaris were represented, classified, and condemned. This anti-Judaism was rooted in early Muslim approaches to the Quran and evident in the various modes of reading and interpretation in the medieval Islamic world. David Nuremberg has argued that Jewish duplicity and enmity would become a basic axiom of Quranic ontology, while demonstrating the Quran's use of Jews as figures for the confusion of godliness and falsity, and as an explanation for the vicissitudes of prophetic truth in this world. In a crucial intervention, this might be known to many of you, of course. This is from Anti-Judaism. Nuremberg has also argued that, quote, early Islam made its claim to truth through the logic of supersession and that appropriates Judaism and includes it within itself, while at the same time defining itself against that Judaism as a perversion of prophecy, stigmatized, enslaving, hostile, to be left behind by the believer. Again and again, the Islamic tradition invoked the thread of Judaism to make critical sense of its cosmos, with the prophetic material contained in the Quran and the history of early Islam, understood as the life story of Muhammad here, became mutually intelligible through a narrative structure of confrontation between prophecy and its Jewish enemies. And Nuremberg doesn't see this as distinct to Islam and by any respects of the imagination. I mean, he talked about late antiquity and Christianity, but it's very important to think about what this can help us understand here, right, about the scriptural tradition. And these Jewish enemies, as Nuremberg calls them, right, would continually resurface and reappear throughout medieval Islamic history, but always depended for their construction on this fundamentally important Quranic framework, highlighted here. So there was a very long history of anti-Judaism and Islamic heresiography in particular, with many deviant sects, quote unquote deviant sects, right, being ascribed to Jewish founders or lineages, including, ironically, Shi'ism, and more particularly, Nizārī Ismāʿīlism and Fatimid Ismāʿīlism, right? There's a long history of this, right, within Sunni polemics against Shi'ism. So while this deployment of anti-Judaism is most explicit and evident in the writings of Sunni theologians, like everyone's favorites, like Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah, right, during the 14th century, these are actually not the only or even the most significant examples. They're the ones that often get cited again and again, as if there's like some kind of uniqueness, but it's really evident throughout the Shi'i tradition, throughout the Sunni tradition in earlier centuries as well. So since the early Middle Ages, a saying ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad circulated widely throughout the classical Islamic world and was repeated in the famous, perhaps the most famous, heresiographical encyclopedia of Muhammad ibn Abdul Karim al-Shahrastani, which said that the Qadariyah are the Zoroastrians of this community, the Mushabbiha are the Jews of this community, and the Rafida are the Christians of this community. So it's very, very complicated. So these formulas, you make of this, we can talk, this could be a whole talk on its own. So these formulas of identification associated a particular theological deviance and misguidance within the Islamic community with a particular religious community outside of the Muslim community, right? So whether Christians, Jews, or Zoroastrians. This is actually in the preface of Shahrastani. So this anti-Judaism was construed variously in genealogical terms as direct influence of Jews on Muslim thought and practice, and in hermeneutical terms, in which Judaism represented a specific form of theological error and deviance from truth. It would be deployed by various communities and theological schools of Muslims, including Sunnis, Ibadis, Twelvers, Shi'is, Zaydis, and Ismailis, right? So it is within this larger tradition of anti-Judaism that we need to understand the Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah's own brand of this trend, right? So the text provides us with one of the most important examples of how it was put to work within a larger Ismaili cosmology of the Imamate and of the Imam, who was seen as the very embodiment of the word of God. He is the word of God embodied in flesh, right? This is how Fatimid cosmology articulated it. And he serves as the basis of all true guidance. So it sought to argue that the Nizaris, through their active and deliberate rejection of the legitimate Imam of the age, their denial of the truth of his divinely mandated nas or designation, and their establishment of an alternative or counter imamate with its own advocates and defenders actually constitutes a form of tahrif, right? A scriptural alteration or falsification. So this followed from a long-standing Islamic polemical representation of Christian and Jewish communities as knowingly, and the context here is why it's important, knowingly falsifying their own religious scriptures in order to conceal prophecies about Muhammad. So there was a very long tradition here of representing the enemies of the Imams, or even those who failed to recognize the legitimacy of their claims in light of Quranic portraits of Jews and Christians, who'd refused to recognize Muhammad as a fulfillment of biblical prophecies. So this deep-seated hermeneutical anti-Judaism is evident in the earliest Fatimid Ismāʿīlī writings, with Sunnis also presented as Jewish and at times Christian for various reasons. So this idea of Sunnis as the Jews of this community was among the most predominant themes within Fatimid Ismāʿīlī writings, and is particularly evident within the surviving sermons and recently edited and translated sermons of Abu Abdullah Shi'i, the late 9th century Ismāʿīlī missionary in North Africa, who was responsible for the conversion of the Kutama, the Amazigh confederation that laid the foundations of Fatimid political power in the region, with Sunnis being accused of following the tradition, the Sunnah, right, the example of the Banu Israel and imitating them. There were three key aspects to this critique. First, the accusations of alteration or falsification of scripture, tahrif. Usually embodied here, if the Imam is the word of God, right? Tahrif here then means the deliberate concealment of true knowledge about the Imam's identity and who he is, and failing to uphold the divine covenant of obeying him and recognizing him. The elevation, number two, the elevation of religious scholars and jurists as lords aside from God. In the same manner as Jews and Christians, according to this sermon, established their rabbis, priests, and monks. And most importantly, finally, the establishment of false imams or idols, which they worshipped as deities instead of God. In one of his sermons, Abu Abdullah Shi'i here makes this comparison quite explicit by designating the Sunni rejection of the legitimacy of Ali ibn Abi Talib's divinely mandated succession, his nas, from Muhammad, as a form of Jewish theological error. The Jews of our nation, right, that's the same exact phrase, said that the Prophet did not designate Ali as commander, and he was not the closest to the believers after the apostle of God. They declared his being a brother of the apostle of God a lie, and denied Ali's being his minister and executor within his family and successor in his community. This was just like the Jews who denied the prophethood of Jesus, in accord with the tradition, sunnah, of the Israelites, and in imitation of them. So anti-Judaism would also structure other texts within this context, this early milieu of the Fatimids. So this is not a creation of the 12th century. And I can point to other examples. Here, Al-Qa'im, right? Still a prince at the time, will become caliph eventually. Here he's accusing the Sunnis, particularly in lands under the sway of the Abbasids, as having, basically embodied the same kinds of ideas that we've been talking about. So Fatimid polemics during the early 12th century drew upon this broader tradition. And it's very important for us to remember this tradition has its own Fatimid iteration. And this is what's being put to work here. Which frequently compared the Nizaris, not just with rebellious Israelites and the Banu Israel, but with deviant companions of the Prophet in the past. So now there's a conflation, not just within the anti-Judaism that we're seeing as sort of, Nizaris as sort of Banu Israel, but Nizaris as Sunnis, right? Hassan al-Sabah kind of as a new Abu Bakr, if you will, right? And these are very complicated polemical traditions, but the way that the text brings them together is very important. And this is sometimes made very explicit in other Fatimid texts produced by Ibn Sayrafi, where he says that the Imam al-Musta'li Billah is in the station of Ali, and their lord, Hassan, is in the station of Abu Bakr, right? A reference to the first caliph who was deemed illegitimate by the Ismāʿīlīs for his usurpation of the position of Ali, according to Shi'i thought. So the centrality of ta'wil, or allegorical esoteric interpretation of the Quran within Ismāʿīlī doctrine is paramount for better understanding the ways in which this reflected the co-production of sectarian identity. So the principle of Ismāʿīlī ta'wil relied upon the idea that all phenomena have a zahir and they have a batin, an apparent and an esoteric meaning, and the Imam acts as a guide to the inner meaning, the mediator, if you will. So Fatimid Ismāʿīlī thinkers frequently provided an allegorical interpretation of Quranic verses in the Middle Ages about earlier prophets as references to the Imams and their followers, while verses critical of the Israelites were interpreted as references to the earliest Muslim community of Muhammad, especially in the ways that they rejected the Imamate of Ali. So it was this system of interpretation with its emphasis on the Imam's ability to provide, but again, key, not always divulge, right? But to provide the esoteric truth underlying particular verses of the Quran that underpin many of the claims and the arguments within the Hidāyah, al-Āmiriyyah. And because I'm running short on time here, I also want to jump to the final part of this talk. I can talk more about tahrif, about anti-Judaism within the text if there's interest, but basically it's very important for me just to show you one last kind of section of this, from this passage, to give you a sense of how clearly tahrif is articulated. So this is explicitly invoked, this charge of tahrif, which is very much typed in many ways as a Jewish crime in the Quran, right? As an Israelite trait in the Quran. So the Nizaris have squandered the speaking and living word of God. Al-Mustansir, right? This is who the speaking and living word of God is. And have distorted his sincere and truthful proofs, and they have improperly taken his gracious mercy and transferred it from its proper place without any evidence of designation or proof of any kind. So woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then they say this is from God. So it's a very extensive quote. As I said, I wish I had more time to kind of elaborate on this, but we can maybe talk about this in the Q&A. There's a lot here. There's a lot going on, and tahrif is being explicitly employed as a concept. So through the employment of ta'wil, it's very important. This is the last part of my talk today. It's important to think about how Israelite history was interpreted in light of the Islamic present. So with a particular emphasis upon the notion of the imamate, which was closely in conversation with particular conceptions of biblical kingship and prophecy. it is to this question that I want to now turn. So the centrality of the Imam and the doctrine of the Imamate within Fatimid Ismāʿīlism meant that the biblical past, especially as mediated through the early Islamic traditions in the Quran and Hadith, took on new and important meaning within this particular intellectual tradition. So the development of a particular idea of cyclical history, which was viewed as adwar, is what it was called in the Fatimid context, which was viewed as being reflected within the Quran, accessible through the mechanism of allegorical esoteric interpretation, ta'wil, by the Imam and his followers, was articulated through specific doctrines of the Imamate. I mean, you can talk about Nasiruddin Tusi, but I'm not going to dwell on this for now because that's a whole other, rabbit hole. So this idea of cycles, basically, and of the Imams and prophets was closely linked with the allegorical interpretation of verses of the Quran and significantly of the Bible. So the writings of the early 11th century Fatimid Ismāʿīlī author Ahmad ibn Ibrahim an-Naisapuri gives us evidence of this, right? God the Exalted has indeed mentioned the story of the past communities and the prophets in order that they should show that they should know that the same would happen in the cycle of the Prophet Muhammad as it did in the other cycles. The Prophet said, "My community will experience exactly what happened among the children of Israel." He also said, "You will follow the footsteps of those before you step by step in an identical manner to the extent that if they were to enter the burrow of a lizard, you would follow them into it." So this is very clear, right? It's very evident in many of these Ismāʿīlī texts. And then we have other kinds of examples of this. Again, there's too numerous to mention now. But it is very significant here that even as the Hidāyah co-produces, sectarian identity and employs anti-Judaism as its frame for classifying religious deviance, for classifying misguidance, it simultaneously appropriates biblical figures and texts claiming the heritage of the ancient Israelites in defense of its particular ideas about these cycles and about the Fatimid Ismāʿīlī Imamate. So there's two things happening here. So the Hidāyah provides an allegorical interpretation of scripture to claim that the succession crisis that took place following al-Mustansir's death in 1094 should be understood as analogous to the division of Solomon's kingdom following his death, King Solomon of the Bible, right? Al-Mustansir, the text explains on the basis of the ta'wil of Quran 2:102, was the corresponding imam within the current historical cycle. I hope I haven't lost any of you here. Dawr. Okay. As Solomon has been among the children of Israel. So indeed, our master, Al-Mustansir Billah, having the corresponding station as imam to the station of Solomon vis-a-vis the children of Israel, is the one being indicated in this Quranic verse by the word Solomon. So it's very important here. Verily, the Prophet said, "My community will experience exactly what happened among the children of Israel, step by step in an identical manner." Indeed, the Solomon of this nation, right, is our master Al-Mustansir Billah, because his number in the line of the Imams is exactly the same as that of Solomon in his line of the leaders of the children of Israel. Moreover, he, Al-Mustansir, was given dominion and kingship, the likes of which none of his ancestors had possessed, just as Solomon was given such an extensive dominion. He was also given command over the winds and the devils in the same manner as Solomon. The command of the winds refers here to the divine assistance given to him in every circumstance, and the command over the devils refers to his subjugation of all opponents, his adversaries, and those who did not heed his commands. So ta'wil within ta'wil, right? This is very important in the Ismāʿīlī tradition. So the Hidāyah interprets the Quranic story about Solomon in light of these events that transpired in the last days of al-Mustansir's life, employing ta'wil in the service of a very particular idea of succession within the context of the Fatimid Caliphate. As for the Almighty's words, "And verily Solomon did not disbelieve," this means that our master Al-Mustansir Billah did not disbelieve, nor did he deny the truth of his knowledge of the Imam to succeed him. Indeed, he appointed our master Al-Mustali as Imam on the day of his wedding in the presence of many witnesses, and he further designated him as Imam at the moment of his death. Fi daqiqat intiqalihi is the Arabic. Thus, this is not a matter which is open to interpretation, nor was it doubted by anyone present. But this has been denied by the one who has followed his base desires and the pleasures of this world and turned the imamate and caliphate into a matter of competition and a source of envy. Due to this, the Almighty said, "Verily, the devils have disbelieved," meaning that these people who oppose the truth and excessively engage in trickery, thereby becoming misguided and misguiding in others in the process. So this is interesting due to this is actually doing a lot of work here, right? So past, present, future have all come together in some very interesting ways. So this engaged with a well-established mode of allegorical scriptural exegesis, evident among numerous Ismāʿīlī authors throughout the early medieval period. It is the next passage within the text, however, that is particularly noteworthy. And it is here that the Hidāyah draws upon extra Quranic material, directly invoking the Book of Kings of the Hebrew Bible to make a particular claim about al-Musta'li's position within the current cycle or dawr, which he identifies with that of the biblical king Rehoboam, right? So the Nizaris are cast into the role of Jeroboam and his followers. And this is very clear. Such an interpretation is further supported by what is contained in the books of the children of Israel. Solomon had designated his son Rehoboam as Imam, just as our master al-Mustansir Billah designated our master al-Musta'li Billah. A certain person, Jeroboam, envied Rehoboam and rebelled against him, and he was followed by a group whom he had beguiled by his deceit and whom he had seduced by his sorcery. Jeroboam altered the foundations of the faith and led his followers off the straight, clear path of guidance, just as Nizar did in his rebellion against our master, al-Musta'li. The misfortune of Jeroboam and his followers occurred in the same way as it occurred for Nizar and his followers. And the fortunate end belonged to Solomon's son, the one who possessed the truth, just as the fortunate end belonged to our master al-Musta'li Billah, the commander of the faithful. So this is a particularly fascinating case of allegorical interpretation, especially for those of us who know the Bible, maybe the Hebrew Bible. You can see there's something very funny happening here, very important happening here, since it provides an important reflection within the text on a key moment of religious and political schism, which would culminate in the eventual destruction and weakening of the Israelites, according to the sort of the narratives that they are inheriting. So there's an implicit acknowledgement by the Hidāyah of the destructive nature of the Musta'li-Nizārī debate here, which is fascinating, and even a tacit admission that more than simply a small minority of Ismāʿīlīs belonged to the Nizārī faction. And it's important to recall here that it was produced during a moment of crisis across the Ismāʿīlī community. In 1129, the entire Ismāʿīlī community, Nizaris and Musta'lis alike of Damascus, would be massacred, right, by Sunni mobs. So there's acknowledgement here, even tacitly, of what's going on. But the foundational principle of this allegorical interpretation was to cast al-Musta'li in the role of Rehoboam, the son and successor of Solomon, while depicting Hassan al-Sabah, or Nizar, pick your pick, as Jeroboam, a figure responsible for leading the true believers astray and erecting false idols. So this comparison was invoked during a specific moment of crisis and of division. And there's much that can be said about this particular ta'wil of the Hebrew Bible. Quotation of the Hebrew Bible, I should mention here, is not uncommon in texts produced by the Fatimid Ismāʿīlī Daʿwah. We have a very prominent case of Hamid ad-Din al-Kirmani in the 11th century that has been very well studied by both Paul Walker, but more especially in 1931, in a very, very excellent Dar Islam article by Paul Krauss. It's a very well-known article, which I would encourage you guys to read, in which Kirmani cites sort of Syriac kind of scripture from the Gospel of John to illustrate that Muhammad was designated a prophet by none other than Jesus, for example. So the engagement with the Bible, whether the Gospels or the Hebrew Bible, is not uncommon. But there's something really important that's happening here. The particular allegorical interpretation itself, the parallelism that's being established between al-Musta'li and his biblical antecedents, is quite unique. There is a sharp contrast between how the Hidāyah deploys the figure of Rehoboam and the intense hostility towards this figure that we can see among other authors in the medieval Islamic world. So in the writings of Ibn Hazm, for example, always a charmer, we know, right? This figure is represented as an idolater and as a disbeliever whose reign was marked by political demise and weakness, a far cry from how the Hidāyah depicts him. And this passage itself is, of course, also a reflection of the various types of uses or misuses of biblical history in the larger Islamic world. There's an interesting kind of phenomenon happening here. Similarly, in Bar Hebraeus, for example, we also see a negative representation of Rehoboam. And other authors within the medieval Islamic tradition, Ibn Khaldun, al-Mas'udi, also provide a rather unflattering representation, while all concurring that his reign marked the division of the unified kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So Ibn Wadih al-Yaqubi, however, is the only author I know of within the Islamic tradition, the early Islamic tradition, that provides an extensive narrative of Rehoboam's reign that very closely follows the structure, terminology, and narrative of the Book of Kings of the Bible, with some significant differences. There is also a negative representation of Jeroboam by all these authors, but unlike the Hidāyah, it's not put in the service of aggrandizing or legitimating his rival. So the deployment here of Jeroboam as a source of dissension bears a strong resemblance to Karaite, Rabbinite polemics during the same period. Karaite authors active within the Fatimid Caliphate, who wrote in Arabic, such as Yaqub al-Kirkisani, around 950, invoked Jeroboam as a figure of division and often cast their Rabbinite opponents as linked with this figure and the dissension that he fomented. According to al-Kirkisani, again, writing around 950, Jeroboam was a progenitor of the Rabbinites and the first, quote, the first who brought dissension into the religious camp and sowed the seeds of rebellion in Israel, and, quote, who altered the precepts of the religion and falsified them. So there were significant translations of the Hebrew Bible into Arabic by Jews during the Fatimid period. That we know, with Karaite scholars and exegetes playing a particularly important role in this regard. And again, we know a lot about this because of the excellent work that Marina Morostaw has produced. In fact, we know a lot about everything here because of a lot of excellent work that Marina Morostaw has produced. But these translations and the exegetical tracks associated with them would have been familiar to at least a few Fatimid Ismāʿīlī authors. And by the early 12th century, there's a very long history of Muslim engagement with Arabic translations of the Bible, produced by both Christians and Jews. Despite some notable exceptions, however, very few Muslim authors engaged directly with the biblical text. So as David Hollenberg has noted, Ismāʿīlī allegorical interpretation of the biblical events and figures should be understood primarily, although not exclusively within a specifically Islamic polemical milieu. And this is where co-production really comes in handy. And this is what renders it such an important instance of what I'm calling religious co-production. So in the case of al-Āmir's refutation of the Nizāris, biblical history played an important role in both the construction of the Imam as a figure of authority and in casting his enemies in the role of deviant Israelites and Jews. And this is done endlessly within the text. So the primary importance of the Hidāyah's invoking of Rehoboam here and Jeroboam is to indicate the importance of cycles, adwar, and cyclical history as a cornerstone of Fatimid Ismāʿīlī cosmology. But this employment of biblical texts and examples should not be understood simply as an attempt to invoke historical precedent to strengthen a particular claim to succession, although obviously that's what's going on here. But the idea of cycles, alongside the theological understanding of the Imam as the authoritative guide and dispenser of allegorical interpretation, meant that the authority for the present, as Paul Sanders says, quote, the authority for the present could be sought in past events, while the true meaning of past events can be understood only in terms of the present. So the employment of Ismāʿīlī ta'wil to simultaneously make claims about ancient Israel and contemporary events in the 12th century Islamic world was based upon, again, Paula Sanders, quoting her here, underlying assumption is that the past assumes its true meaning only through its fulfillment and completion in the present. There's a very historical theology at play here within these cosmologies. So the Fatimid present was thus embedded within a multivalent and allegorical interpretation of Islamic history that cast al-Mustansir as Solomon, al-Musta'li as a highly rehabilitated Rehoboam, and Nizar and his followers as Jeroboam. Simultaneously, al-Musta'li was cast in the place of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Nizar in the place of Abu Bakr, with the Nizaris as corruptors of texts, violators of covenants, promoters of idolatry, and ardent opponents of the Imams and the Prophets. The phrase, the Jews of this community, was the device through which this allegorical interpretation was made possible, and transformed the emerging Nizārī Ismāʿīlī movement into the embodiment of all things that Fatimid Ismāʿīlism sought to represent itself as opposing. For all intents and purposes, the followers of Jeroboam in ancient Israel, the companions of Muhammad following his death, and the Nizaris in 12th century Iran and Syria were all considered Jewish in the ways that they egregiously violated the divine covenant by failing to acknowledge the legitimate Imam of the age. This critique was embedded within centuries of Quranic hermeneutic, sectarian polemic, and theological discourse, which rendered the idea that the Nizārī Ismāʿīlīs were the Jews of the Muslim community legible to Fatimids and Seljuks, Sunnis and Shi'is alike. And this anti-Judaism, while explicitly rejecting Jewish claims on prophecy, authority, and history, also sought to claim and appropriate the Hebrew Bible by casting a legitimate Imam in the tradition of Solomon, thereby representing the Fatimid Ismāʿīlīs as legitimate heirs of both biblical prophecy and biblical kingship. Thank you very much. I hope I kept time okay.
Yeah, 46 minutes, so perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that
Thank you
wonderful.
for your patience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, Mohamad. I would like to now open the floor to questions. For those online, again, feel free to type in the Q&A, and those in person may raise their hand. Yes, please, Marian.
From foreigners and their food,
Right.
in the sense that, like, I think there's a way in which, if you're sort of thinking about, say, Quranic paradigms for the sort of stigmatized other, that obviously, like, you know, polytheists are obviously the worst, right? But Jews are sort of like the almost us or the deviant us, right? And I think, you know, there's a way in which maybe theologically Christians are similar, but there, to the best of my memory, there are no, other than saying that, the theology of the Trinity is wrong. There aren't a lot of sort of narratives of schism that go along with the figure of the Christian. So like, I sort of wondered, I mean, I feel as if the sort of almost us quality or the deviant us,
Right.
the deviant self quality of the Jews is part of what makes them so useful.
Absolutely. I think that's excellent. What was the name of the which David Friedenreich book were you referring to? Or Foreigners and Their Food. Yes, excellent. I haven't revisited that in a while. Yeah. Sure. No, I mean all of them. All his work is excellent, I find. So because I think his new book, Jewish Muslims, is what you're thinking of as well, which is excellent. I have to also recommend that to everyone. I think that's great. I think that's one of the things that I'm seeing in the sources that I was increasingly surprised by how much of this came across in the Ismāʿīlī tradition. So it started off by just looking at this one document, and I found myself, and I guess you guys find yourselves, being sucked back into the past in ways that you didn't expect, right? So this is very helpful to think about, kind of the other that's also the self in so many respects. So I think it's really, really useful. So thank you. Yeah. Yes. I should.
Others.
Oh,
Thank you, Mohamad. This was very, very fascinating and enlightening. I really learned a lot from you as usual. And my question, what your talk made me think about how the others are mentioned within a sectarian polemic in the Ottoman and Safavid cases. And more often than not, you hear that they are mentioned as worse than Jews, worse than Christians, worse than anybody you can imagine. So that's why they need to be dealt with. That's why they need to be killed. So here, this is a very different, of course, we are talking about 400 or 500 years prior to that. And I wanted to see if you can actually trace, or if it is traceable to go from this group, this community within this sect are Jews of this and Muslims and Christians of this too. They're actually not even that, they're actually worse than Jews and Christians.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And I mean, I was introduced to the marvelous world of sectarian polemics through the world of Ottoman Safavid exchanges, of course. And that takes things to a whole different level. But I took inspiration from the scholarship about that when I was thinking about this paper, because it's important to keep in mind the imperial context and the very real implications for life and death for some of these communities, right? We're not even involved in these polemical exchanges themselves, but are implicated within them. But I do think that there are sort of antecedents to the Safavid Ottoman declarations of you're worse than X or you're worse than Y in those formulas that we see. X are the Mushabaha of this. The Mushabaha are the Jews of this community. The Rafida are the Christians of this community. It's to try to basically one up, the others' polemic against this community. But in this case, there's absolutely a similitude that's being established. And I wonder if in Safavid texts in particular, there will be a similar type of attack against, especially as by the 17th century, anti-Jewish sentiment is at its height in Safavid Iran, you'll start to see a conflation between our Sunni enemies, right, and our Jewish ones, right? And vice versa, right? Attacks against Jews are being represented as an attack against the people who don't recognize legitimate religion. And I want to add one more thing here, because you mentioned the comparative dimension, which I think is crucial. This is the same exact moment when this individual in the Highlights Mountains called Ibn Tumart is on the rise in founding the Almohad Empire. And he's using the exact same formulations against the Almoravids, right? And of course, the empire that he founds will be very exclusionary in terms of its religious policies. So the fact that Shahrastani is putting pen to paper at this exact moment in Iran, Ibn Tumart is preaching in the Hayatlis, and Ibn Sayrafi is writing this, tells us something really important, I think, about the comparative. But I would love to go through the Ottoman text and see how much of this will be present. I would love to go through the Safavid kind of polemical treatises. And I'm thinking here of Shushtari, right? Nurullah Shushtari, to try to think about those things. But that's like a long-term project. But thank you. That's an excellent example. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. I think just jumping off on this, on the Safavid context, the work of Catherine Babayan comes to mind, because it's almost, in that situation, you almost have the opposite, where it's excess prophecy that's kind of seen as the threat to be to polemicize against and to contain. And here it's kind of like the rejection of prophecy is the thing being stigmatized. So I wonder whether these on both ends, what you have really is a struggle about the correct relationship to history that that determines correct theology.
Absolutely right. I think that's what's key here, right? Is we are going to provide, in the end, this is in the voice. This is the crucial thing. It's written by Ibn Sayrafi, right? But it's supposed to be in the voice of the Imam, right? So here, this is supposed to be, the Imam is correcting your deviance. And that's why they send a copy. In my mind, it must have been a much more diplomatic copy to Hassan-i-Sabah, right? Let me bring you guys back in, right? Let's try to figure this out, maybe. Who knows? We don't have that copy. But I think it's very important, like the language of correction of, I will show you what this history actually means. I will explain to you what this scriptural kind of verse means, right? Is very much present. But it very much is understood as imamate as prophecy and prophecy as imamate. They're very tied together. And that's actually why I think that dimension should not be underestimated here. It's very much fully at play. For some reason, a lot of scholarship has tended to not take very seriously the claims of the Mustalians in this respect, but they're as articulate and as authoritative as Abu Abdullah Shi'i's first sermons were, right? They're using the same exact language, sometimes consciously, right? So I do think it's useful to think to that later period as well and what it can help us understand. And as a segue to that, when were these manuscripts transcribed? These manuscripts were transcribed in the world of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. That's where they survived from. Most of these manuscripts come from India, right? So that's the milieu that's producing the corpus of text that we have, right? So it's very important to keep this in mind as well. We can't separate this out. Many of the copies. Yes, I can. Yes.
The life and legacy of
Yeah, no. Yes, so it's mostly coming from the Bohra community of Western India in this period. So, and a lot of these texts have survived because of, you know, the painstaking work of the Ismāʿīlī Institute, of course, right? Which is not a Mustali institution, right? Which is just really important to keep in mind. So the editor of the text, it was edited in the early 20th century, Faizi, right? Was able to kind of bring those texts to the light of history, so to speak. There's a lot in those libraries that are still coming to light, right? I haven't worked directly in those libraries. I don't have access to those libraries, right? It's very privileged access, but it's very important to think about the afterlives of these communities themselves and how that's shaping what texts have been transcribed or not transcribed, right? In this case. So, and I kind of defer to the authority of the scholars who come before me about the authenticity of the text. I think they make good arguments for why we should not think of these as forgeries from the 18th century. But I do think we should take seriously the fact that that act of transcription is what gives us, I'm a historian, right? So thinking about this all the time, like, how do I know what I know? It's very essential to keep that part as part of the stories. Part of the story. This is why that medieval early modern divide never makes much sense to me on any given day, right? Which makes my students go crazy. But it's very important to think about these two histories and how intersecting they are. So, but I can say more on any specific aspect of that.
Great, thank you. We have some questions online. So we have a question from Kyle Lincoln, who says, greetings from the Texas-Oklahoma borderlands. Excuse me. I know in some of your other work, you spend a lot of time thinking about the transfer or sharing of knowledge across boundaries, political, social, religious. And I'm wondering whether we can trace the exporting of these discourses to Latin or Greek Christian contexts, or an importing of similar language, anti-Latin after 1204 or anti-heretical after 1209, back into successor discourses after the waning of the Fatimids.
Wow. Well, thank you, Kyle, for the question. It's a big question. I don't think I can answer that. I do think that there are avenues of inquiry that we should pursue to think about other sectarian communities that are being formulated within Egypt in this period. This is what I started with, right? The Fatimid realm, and Cairo in particular, and Alexandria, give us this really capacious kind of imperial context for thinking about polemical exchange. So I wonder if I was to delve into the texts of the Christian communities in this period, whether we'd see a similar type of language being formulated, especially when those of them writing in Arabic. But I haven't pursued this. I haven't thought about this too much, but it's an excellent, excellent question, I think. And I do think that at least of the Latin Christian discourses I'm seeing in the 12th and 13th centuries, the so-called war on heresy, they deploy similar types of ideas where they try to establish biblical genealogies and antecedents for groups in the present that they are deeming to be heretical. And often, more often than not, right, you also do see an anti-Judaism that permeates that discourse. But not only anti-Judaism, there are other older heresiographical discourses. But that's all I can say on that.
Great, thank you. We have another question online from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for the great talk. We know about we know about attempts from al-Āmir to establish communications with the Nizáris by gathering Shi'i scholars and asking their legal opinions about the issue. Do we know of any reflections about this from the Nizáris?
Well, we only have in one of the manuscript traditions, so there are 3 manuscripts that I've been able to find where 2 texts are bound together. So there's this one text, the Hidāyah al-Āmiriyyah, and then there's another text called the Iqā' Sawā'iq al-Irgham, okay, because the titles just get more polemical. The hurling of the lightning bolts of compulsion, which is a response to the Nizārī response. But we don't have much of the Nizārī response. We only have like a short summary of it, like a 1-2 paragraph summary of it. And it basically is kind of mocking al-Āmir's epistle, right? And saying you clearly haven't read your Quran properly. You clearly weren't there when Mustansir designated Nizar like 5 times, right? Your arguments are weak. Your rhetoric is worse. It's very polemical, but that's all we have. We don't know of it in any other way. I actually dug through every hagiographical text I could from between the 12th and 17th centuries to find any remnant of Hasan Sabah's response. No. And if it was there, someone would have gotten to it before I did. I can assure you of that. But it's hard to know how they responded. They did respond in one way. Al-Āmir was assassinated by the Nizáris. So they were not very happy. That much we know, but we don't know of their actual refutation. And again, there's this really tragic moment in 1129. The entire Ismaili community of Damascus is essentially destroyed, right, by the Sunni mobs, right, in that area. So we can't know what afterlives that polemical tradition would have had in Damascus in particular. But it does seem that Damascus is a bigger part of the story than many scholars have formerly noted. It's much more of a presence in the early period when al-Āmir was caliph than later on. So that's one way I would address that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We can now switch to an in-person question. Yes. Okay, I will. We have a few more online. So we have Maya, sorry for Irish, forgive me for maybe perhaps mispronouncing, asks, at what point does anti-Judaism as described by you and David Nuremberg cross over into anti-Semitism in either Islamic or Christian context? Should medievalists use the term anti-Semitism at all?
This is definitely a question for discussion. This is a really important question. I actually don't have an answer to this, but except to say that for me as a scholar, this is where I can maybe bring myself back to medieval Iberia, where I belong maybe, right? Late medieval Iberia, where we start to see a more racialized discussion of lineage and as an idea where your religious identity is inevitably tied, right, to your descent. That's where I would use anti-Semitism. I don't want to lose that moment of history, because again, we don't want to say all anti-Judaism is anti-Semitism, because there is something specific about anti-Semitism as a form of hatred, right? When I think of the blood libel, for example, in medieval Europe, that to me strikes me very heavily as anti-Semitic. There's something really genealogical about some of these arguments that are being made, right? But I do think that there's grounds for talking about anti-Semitism, especially in the medieval Islamic world, because I don't think it didn't exist before the 19th century. Some scholars have tried to say that. But for me, I think anti-Judaism, I'm convinced by that more than I am by anti-Semitism for the medieval period anyways. Yeah, Marian, please. Oh, wow, great. Yeah, yeah.
I feel as if there are sort of 2
right
questions that one could tease out from that.
Yeah.
One would be,
Sorry, Mary. Is there a microphone?
We should give him yeah.
Sorry, Mary.
Yeah, no, just so they can hear on Zoom. Yeah.
one would be the sort of question that you were responding to, which is, to what extent,
Right.
if at all, does this sort of prefigure meaningfully relate to modern forms of
Right.
historical anti-Semitism? But I think the other question would be, in my mind, would be, what, if anything, does purely hermeneutical anti-Judaism, in other words, Jews as figures within the sort of rhetorical construct of the Quran, being sort of available,
Right.
Sort of points on the map of self-identity and stigmatized others that are going to be available for Muslim thinkers, as opposed to is there any meaningful connection with, sort of how they're relating to Jews on the ground.
Right.
Like, regardless of whether the ways in which they're relating to Jews on the ground have anything to do with like 19th century anti-Semitism,
Precisely.
right?
That's a great question. And you know, I should also add that Maya here is as more equipped than I am to even answer this question because she works on this for Spain. But I think this is Nuremberg's argument as well. He says, anti-Judaism doesn't require interaction or presence of real Jews. Whereas anti-Semitism is in many ways, of course, it's also intellectually not dependent on the existence of real Jews or what they do or don't do, right? Anti-Semitic thought has its own logics here too, but it is directed against very real Jewish communities. And this is what I think we should also be thinking of at the same time. So anti-Judaism tends to be more figural in my mind and hermeneutic, whereas anti-Semitism has to do with real anti-Jewish sentiment on the ground. It has real implications in that respect. But this doesn't make anti-Judaism any less real. This is actually why I'm conflicted about this, right? Because some of these representations are also very violent. They're very violent and polemical representations of Jewish people and Jewish communities. To refer to a whole community as killers of prophets, for example. I mean, that is deployed by anti-Semites today in the Islamic world, right? And it's weaponized in new ways, though, in ways that are very different in the way that this text, for example, puts it to work. So I do think there's an intersecting history here of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that still needs to be told, right? And I'm also thinking here, of course, of earlier Christian iterations of similar questions, like John Chrysostom and his Adversus Judaeos sermons. Are they anti-Semitic? Are they anti-Jewish, right? When he's preaching almost entirely to a Christian audience, that's where those sermons come from. We need to start thinking about these questions, I think, in a lot more detail. Sorry, it's a very insufficient response to a very good question, but this is one of the ways that I think about this. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mohamad.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have a few more questions online, but if you, okay. So we have another anonymous attendee, perhaps the same, asking, does the Hidāyah admit an appointment for Nizār? What was the Nizārī response to the Hidāyah? I mean, you mentioned this briefly, and they add, I believe it's in the appendix.
Okay. I think that the person knows the answer then, but it's basically, yes, of course it admits an appointment for Nizār. That's the whole point. Is the whole idea here is to refute the idea that Nizār was the designated Imam. But to do so, it has to first acknowledge that there was something that may have been maybe perhaps a designation earlier on in Mustansir's life. But that's actually why the text that I showed you says Mustali was designated twice. Right? And at the moment of his death is key here. And that last designation was the real one, the realness, right? So from a Nizārī perspective, this is a very weak argument. And in fact, the paraphrase of the Nizārī response we have said, so you're basically not an Ismāʿīlī, is what he tells al-Āmir, because you have made the same argument theologically here that the Twelvers have made about Musa al-Kadhim, right? That the Nas can be changed, that it's not irrevocable. Right? Although that's not how al-Āmir would have articulated it, this is clearly how it's seen by the Nizāris. Like this is a weak claim. This is a very weak claim, and saying that someone was appointed at their wedding as successor because they sat on the right hand, not great. But there is a strong theological claim, and it's a very important logic theologically that's being articulated within the text. We should not look at these later polemics between Nizāris and Mustalis and project it onto what's going on. So. But the truth is, we don't actually have a fully fledged Nizārī response at that moment, right? We just don't. And this puts it into perspective, I think. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mohamad.
Yeah.
We have another question online by Benny Barlevi, which I think you may have tangentially touched on in your answer to another question. But did these deployments of Judaism produce any noticeable changes in attitudes towards real flesh and blood rabbinic and Karaite Jews?
This is something I need to research further. I actually can't answer that. But I'm assuming that yes, of course. I think the existence of anti-Judaism in these societies needs to be I mean, again, this is maybe my approach as a historian. I'm interested in politics as well. I do think will have an impact on what's going on. Like for looking at the Almohads sort of as a separate case study here, right? The types of anti-Jewish, anti-Christian discourse that started off as anti-Almoravid discourse very quickly became anti-Jewish and anti-Christian policy, right? In a lot of respects, right? But it's hard to say without looking very specifically at the social dynamics and histories here. But we do know that there are still people employed, including by al-Āmir, who are Jewish and Christian within the chancery. Samaritans, we have Rabbinites, right? We have Karaites, right? So it's very important to understand this. And there are Christians as well who hold positions of office, right? And one wonders, I mean, how involved they were in these texts, in the production of these texts. These are chancery productions, after all. So it's very interesting to think about this. But My sense is, yes, there is going to be changes in attitudes, right? Maybe the populace, right, will be hearing this and it'll amplify some kind of deep-seated anti-Judaism, but it's hard to know. This is conjectural. I don't have evidence for any of this, but it needs to be studied further, in my mind. Yeah, but I haven't pursued that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Okay.
We do have a final question online, I think about perhaps modern reception of these ideas in Ismaili communities. But thank you for your insightful talk, Professor Faisal Devji's comparison of the formation of Pakistan in 1948 to the modern state of Israel as a Muslim Zion is thought-provoking. Do you believe such polemical tactics still persist within Ismaili communities in a modern context?
Far out of my sort of my wheelhouse in a lot of ways, modern Ismaili sort of discussions about these things. But yes, I do think that that sort of engagement with the biblical past, right, and biblical figures and Jewish or Christian figures very much structures Muslim politics today. I think it very much is the case. I mean, the idea of a Muslim Pakistan as a Muslim Zion, right, is useful to look into. But I do think we should for the 20th century, really draw ourselves into the networks and the political discussions that are happening among these elites in that period. And Agha Khan III, for example, is an extraordinary figure in this respect, the third Agha Khan, right? Because he was very embedded within all of these communities and in all of these political discussions, right? And his writings try to engage with the Ismaili historical tradition while trying to modernize it for the present and to think of it in the world of nation states and what that means. So, but it's a great question, Jahrad. Sorry, not a great answer, but maybe I can talk more with you about it soon.
Great, thank you. And we have no more questions online, and looks like we have no more questions in person. So again, I'd like to thank Mohamad today for this wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. And again, this is really preliminary, so thank you for indulging me and engaging with this. I really appreciate it.
And thank you all online and in person for attending and supporting this event series all year. It's been great to see everyone coming again. And also thank you all online and in person for your great questions.
Right.
And hopefully see many of you next year.